He came to her door at midnight, not with a knock, with a boot heel, straight through the wood panel, so she understood before he even opened his mouth who was in charge. Victor Crane stood in the splinters of what used to be her door, his coat pressed clean, his eyes flat and cold as February river ice. He didn't shout. Men like Victor never needed to shout. He simply looked at Mara the way a man looks at something he owns, something that forgot its place. "You thought you could leave," he said quietly. "Did you really think I wouldn't find you?" Mara's hands were shaking. She hid them behind her back so he wouldn't see. "If that were you, standing in your own kitchen, nowhere left to run, what would you do?" This is the story of a woman who arrived at a dying ranch in the Montana wilderness, trying to become nobody. What she became instead changed every life she touched. Before we go any further, if stories like this reach something in you, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really started. The train station at Iron Hollow wasn't much of a station. It was a wooden platform with a broken bench, a hand-painted sign that someone had nailed crooked and never bothered to fix, and a stovepipe sticking out of the ticket office that puffed smoke sideways in the wind instead of up. When Mara Voss stepped off the last car of the Northern Pacific Line on a Thursday afternoon in November of 1887, she stood for a moment on that platform and breathed the cold air in deep, the kind of cold that carries pine resin and frozen creek mud and nothing else. No coal smoke, no perfume, no men in expensive coats standing close enough to remind you that you had no right to move away. Just cold, clean air. She carried one carpet bag. Inside it, 2 dresses, a change of underclothes, a small tin of dried herbs she'd learned to use for bread seasoning, and a ceramic crock sealed with cheesecloth and wax that held her sourdough starter, a culture she had been feeding for 9 years, carrying it across 2 states when most people would have thrown it out and started over. She did not throw things out lightly. She had learned the hard way that some things, once lost, do not come back. She also carried scars on both forearms that she kept hidden beneath her sleeves, even in summer. Iron Hollow was a settlement of roughly 300 souls wedged into a valley between 2 mountain ridges that blocked the afternoon sun from October through March. It had a general store, a livery, a church with a bell that had cracked and been replaced, a saloon that mostly behaved itself on weekdays, and a reputation among neighboring counties as the kind of place where people went when they needed to stop being found. Mara fit right in, though she didn't know that yet. She had one name and one destination, Blackthorn Ranch, 6 miles south, owned by a man named Ronan Vale, who had posted a notice in a Denver newspaper 3 weeks prior. Baker needed, room and board included. Inquire at Iron Hollow Post Office. The notice was small and plain and contained no promises, which was precisely what made her trust it. Men who made promises in newspaper notices were usually men who needed something from you they weren't naming outright. This notice just said what it was. She hired a boy with a mule cart to take her the 6 miles for 15 cents, which was 10 cents more than it was worth given the state of the road, but she paid it without argument. She was too tired to argue. She had been tired for 3 years, the particular exhaustion that comes not from hard work, but from the constant effort of watching every door, every face, every shadow at the edge of every room. That kind of tired settles into your bones differently than honest fatigue. It doesn't go away with sleep. The ranch appeared around a bend in the frozen creek road as the light was going blue and dim. She could see the main house first, 2 stories of timber frame, the kind built to last by someone who intended to stay. And then the bunkhouse beside it, the smokehouse, 2 barns, a chicken coop that had seen better years, and beyond all of it, a cattle operation that clearly needed more help than it currently had. Fence posts leaned at angles. The gate hung on one hinge. A stack of split wood beside the smaller barn was half what it should have been for November. She registered all of this the way she registered everything now, quickly, quietly, storing it away like a woman who knew that the details other people overlooked were usually the ones that mattered. The man who opened the front door before she could knock was not what she expected. Ronan Vale was 35, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were too big for the rest of him, in the way of men who started working before they finished growing. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that needed more time than he'd apparently given it, and he looked at her the way people look at new problems they're not sure they have the energy to address. "You're the baker," he said. "Yes," Mara said. He looked at her carpet bag, then at her. You come from Denver? Originally, no. He waited for her to say where originally, and she let the silence sit there until it was clear she wasn't feeling it. Something shifted in his expression, not unfriendly, exactly. More like recognition of a boundary he wasn't going to get past, and had decided in that moment not to try. Kitchen's off the back of the house, he said. There's a room above it, small. The stove in there is either working or it isn't. Billy was supposed to check it, and I haven't confirmed that he did. He stepped back from the door. Supper was an hour ago, but there's leftover stew on the back burner if you haven't eaten. Thank you. He was already turning away when he stopped, one hand on the doorframe, and said it without looking at her directly. My daughter, she's 6. Her name is Elsie. He paused. Don't go out of your way to talk to her. Don't try to be friendly or engage her in conversation. Don't bring her food or gifts or anything she hasn't asked for. Mara waited. She doesn't speak, he said, and his voice did something complicated on that last word, flattened out in a way that told her the flatness was deliberate, controlled, the way you flatten something down to keep it from moving. She hasn't since her mother died. The last woman we hired through the summer tried to make friends with her, and He stopped again. Just leave her be. That's the only rule I have. Can you do that? Mara looked at this man who was clearly drowning in something and had learned to tread water well enough that most people probably couldn't tell. Yes, she said. I can do that. He nodded once and walked away. The stove in her room above the kitchen was working, barely, but working. She lay on her back in the narrow bed that night, listening to the wind come off the ridge and thought, nobody knows you're here. She thought it the same way she had thought it in the 6 other towns she had passed through since Chicago. But this time, something was different. This time, she didn't feel like she was waiting for the next train. She was up before dawn. She had always been a morning person, had discovered early in life that the hours before other people woke up were hers in a way that nothing else was. She stoked the kitchen stove, found the flour bins and the salt and the lard, and spent an hour taking inventory of what was actually there versus what should have been there, writing careful notes in the small leather book she kept for such things. The sourdough starter she fed and set on the warm shelf above the stove. By the time the sky was going gray outside the kitchen window, she had 2 loaves in the oven and biscuits proofing and coffee bricking on the back burner, real coffee, not the chicory substitute she'd found in the tin labeled coffee. She had brought her own beans. Some things weren't negotiable. She set a plate at the head of the kitchen table for Ronan, who she assumed ate in here rather than the formal dining room based on the fact that the formal dining room had boxes stacked in it. And then she set a second plate and a small glass of water at the other end of the table and left a biscuit on it with a drizzle of the honey she had found in the back of the pantry, candied and thick. Then she went to the back door and stood with her coffee and watched the light come over the eastern ridge. She did not hear the small feet on the stairs. She was almost certain she wasn't supposed to. When she came back inside, the second plate was untouched, but the biscuit was gone. In its place, set very carefully on the white rim of the plate, was a small smooth stone the color of creek water and a single blue feather that she could not identify by species. Mara stood at the kitchen table and looked at these 2 small objects for a long moment. Then she washed the plate, refilled the small glass with fresh water, and left a second biscuit in exactly the same spot. She didn't say anything to Ronan about it. She didn't say anything to anyone. 3 days passed like that. Each morning, Mara left something at the end of the table. A biscuit, a small roll, once a piece of bread with jam. Each morning she went outside before the thing could be taken, and each morning when she returned, the food was gone and something had been left in its place. A dried flower, the color of old rust. A white button with 4 holes and a crack across one face. 2 crow feathers tied together with a piece of grass. On the 4th morning, Mara left the bread as always. And then, instead of going outside, she went to stand in the short hallway between the kitchen and the pantry and waited. She had not planned to. She had stood there to get a jar from the high shelf and simply hadn't moved after that. She heard the feet on the stairs, very soft, very careful. A pause at the bottom, then a long, quiet stretch, which she recognized as a child listening for the sound of adult movement. When none came, more footsteps, and then the creak of the kitchen door. Mara stayed very still in the hallway. She could see, just at the edge of the doorframe, a small hand reach up to the table and take the bread. There was a pause. She heard, unmistakably, the tiny soft sound of a child eating. Then the same small hand appeared and placed something on the plate. Mara could not see what, from this angle. The feet retreated, up the stairs, careful as they'd come down. When Mara finally walked into the kitchen and looked at the plate, she found a piece of torn paper no bigger than her thumb. On it, in the large, uneven letters of a child just learning, a T and an H that might have been the beginning of something or might have been all of it. Mara looked at it for a long time. Then she sat down at the kitchen table in the silence of the early morning and felt something move in her chest that she hadn't felt in years, something she'd taken great care to keep buried because feeling it made the rest of it harder. She recognized it because she had been someone who felt things deeply before she'd learned not to. She recognized it as hope. She was still sitting there when Ronan came in for breakfast. He looked at her, then at the table. "Something wrong?" he said. "No," Mara said, and stood and put the coffee in front of him. She was going to keep that rule he'd given her. She meant to. She understood exactly why he had established it. You don't get to be a man raising a wounded child alone without learning which walls to build and which ones to hold. She respected that. She had built her own walls and knew the work that went into them. But the first serious snow came 3 weeks into her time at Blackthorn, and with it came wind that packed itself under the eaves and shook every door frame and drove the temperature inside the house down to something you could see your breath in by nightfall. Mara stoked the kitchen stove as high as she safely dared. She made soup and bread and kept the kettle hot. She heard above her the boots of the ranch hands crossing the bunkhouse floor. She heard Ronan's heavier tread on the ceiling above and the pipes ticking. She heard, at 2 a.m, a child screaming. Not crying, screaming, the way children scream in nightmares, the high, thin sound that has no words in it, only terror. Mara was on her feet before she was fully awake, which told her something about what the sound had found in her. She stood in the kitchen for approximately 4 seconds, talking herself back into the rule. She was good at following rules. She had survived 3 years in Victor Crane's house by following rules perfectly, by being invisible, by making herself small and useful and unnoticed. Rules kept you safe. Breaking them got you hurt. Then the screaming came again, sharper, and Mara was already moving up the stairs. The door to Elsie's room was open. Ronan was in the doorway, having apparently arrived a half step before her, his hand on the door frame and his face doing something that Mara recognized as a parent who doesn't know what to do and knows he doesn't know, which is a specific and terrible kind of helplessness. Elsie was sitting upright in her bed, eyes open but unseeing, rigid the way children go rigid in night terrors, awake but not present, caught in the place between sleep and waking where the nightmare is more real than the room. She was fighting to get away from something that wasn't there. Ronan took 1 step toward her and said her name in the careful voice of a man who had done this before and watched it not work. "Elsie. Elsie, it's—" The child flinched back like she'd been struck. Mara did not think about it. She slipped past Ronan's arm, crossed the room in the dark, and sat on the edge of the mattress. She did not reach for Elsie. She did not try to hold her or wake her. She simply put her hands, open, palms up, on the quilt between them. Still and quiet. The way you hold your hands out near a frightened animal. Not to catch it, just to be there. "It's okay," Mara said softly, and her voice was low and even in the way she had learned to make it when she was trying not to alarm someone whose alarm was already maxed. "You're still here. The storm is outside. You're in your room. The stove is on downstairs. The bread is rising." She said it the same way 3 times. Not louder, not with more urgency, just the same quiet words in the same quiet voice. The way you might hum to yourself, not needing anyone to hear. And Elsie Vale, who had not spoken in 2 years, who had made herself smaller and quieter than most adults thought a 6-year-old capable of, began to come back from wherever she had gone. Not all at once. Slowly, the way winter light comes. The rigid set of her shoulders loosened by degrees. Her breathing changed. Her eyes, still open, began to actually see the room. And then she looked at Mara. Not past her. Not through her. At her. Mara did not move. In the doorway behind them, Ronan Vale stood absolutely still and watched a stranger. His daughter in the middle of the worst night of the year, with the wind screaming under the eaves and the world outside frozen and hostile, simply being with his child the way he had never once managed to since her mother died. Elsie's shoulders came down. Her breathing slowed to something like sleep. Her small hand moved, not reaching exactly. more like settling, and came to rest on top of Mara's open palm on the quilt. Mara did not close her hand around it. She just left it there. Warm, present, not asking for anything. When she finally looked up, Ronan was gone from the doorway. She could not tell, from the darkness of the hall, how long he had been standing there watching, or what it had cost him to walk away. She sat with Elsie until the child's breathing deepened into real sleep. Then she stood, careful not to shift the mattress, and pulled the quilt up and went back downstairs. The kitchen was warm and the bread was rising and the coffee had gone cold while she was upstairs. She made a fresh pot, poured herself a cup, and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet before dawn. She was still sitting there when Ronan came in. He did not sit down. He stood by the stove with his back to her for long enough that she thought maybe he was going to leave without saying anything. She had an answer ready for that too, for being fired, for being told to pack her bag and go. She had her answer rehearsed. But when he spoke, what he said was, "I don't know how you did that." Mara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She wasn't awake, she said. She was caught in the middle. Sometimes you can't reach someone when they're in the middle. You just have to be there. Keep the edges steady. Ronan turned from the stove. He looked tired in a way that was older than one bad night, the kind of tired that accretes, layer by layer, until you can see it in the set of a man's jaw and the way he holds his shoulders too high. "Her mother," he said, and stopped. "You don't have to," Mara said. "No," he said. "I think maybe—" He stopped again, started again. She watched her mother fall. It was quick. "Heart," the doctor said, though I'm not sure he knew anything for certain. Eleanor was here one day and gone the next, and Elsie saw it happen. She was 4. He looked at the floor. She stopped talking that day. 2 years. I took her to a doctor in Billings who said she had suffered a shock and might speak again on her own time or might not. I took her to another doctor who said to just keep talking to her like normal. I took her to a... He stopped. "I don't know what she needs. I've done everything I know how to do." "Maybe she just needs it to not be a problem," Mara said quietly. Ronan looked at her. "When something terrible happens to you," Mara said, "and then every person in your life treats that thing as a problem that needs solving. You carry their worry on top of the original thing. It gets heavier." She paused. "Maybe she just needs someone who doesn't look at her like she's broken." Ronan was very quiet. "I'm not firing you," he said at last. "I know," Mara said. "I'm not—" He pushed a hand through his already disordered hair. "That rule I gave you, about Elsie." Mara waited. "It's still a rule," he said. "But use your judgment." It was not an apology. It was not a declaration of anything. It was a man handing over something he had been gripping too hard for too long and not entirely sure what to do with his hands now that it was gone. Mara nodded once. "Good night," she said. "Morning," he said, because outside the window the sky had gone the pale gray of almost dawn. He looked at it like he was mildly surprised by this fact. "Good morning, then." He left. Mara sat with her coffee and the bread rising in the oven and the small piece of torn paper still on the windowsill above the sink, the T and the H that had been left on a plate in exchange for a biscuit. She looked at it and thought, something is beginning here. She didn't know yet if that was a comfort or a warning, possibly both. The morning after the storm, Ronan Vale came down to breakfast and found his daughter sitting at the kitchen table, not hovering near the doorway, not pressed against the wall the way she usually positioned herself in rooms where other people were, like she was calculating the fastest route to the exit. She was actually sitting at the table, both hands wrapped around a mug of warm milk that Mara had apparently set in front of her, and she was watching Mara work the bread dough with the focused attention of someone who has found something genuinely interesting in a world that has not offered much of that lately. Ronan stopped in the doorway. Neither of them noticed him, or if they did, neither of them acknowledged it. Mara, because she was in the middle of folding a stretch of dough and appeared to be narrating the process under her breath in a low, even voice that wasn't exactly directed at Elsie, but wasn't not directed at her either. And Elsie, because she was watching Mara's hands the way children watch things that confuse and fascinate them in equal measure. "The trick," Mara was saying, "is you can't rush it. You push too hard, it tears. You don't push enough, it won't hold together. It's just about feeling when it's ready." She folded the dough over itself, pressed down with the heel of her hand, turned it a quarter. "Most things are like that, I've found." Elsie did not respond. but she leaned forward slightly over the mug, and that slight lean was… Ronan had to look away for a second, at the wall, at the floor. That small lean forward was the most interested he had seen his daughter in anything in 2 years. He cleared his throat, mostly so they would know he was there, and he could stop feeling like he was watching something private. Mara glanced over her shoulder. "Coffee's on." "Yeah," Ronan said. It's up, Rotara said, and came into the kitchen and got his own cup and sat at his end of the table, and the three of them existed in the same room together without anyone making it a thing. And that was the morning that something at Blackthorn Ranch very quietly and without announcement began to shift. It did not shift smoothly. Nothing real ever does. The weeks that followed the storm had their own particular rhythm. Cold mornings, the kitchen warm from the stove. By the time the ranch hands came in for coffee, Mara's bread. A presence that had begun, Ronan noticed, to affect the general mood of the place in ways he couldn't entirely quantify. The men came to breakfast in better spirits than they used to. Conversations lasted longer. Billy Fitch, who had been with Blackthorn for 4 years and communicated primarily in grunts and weather observations, had taken to lingering over his second cup and offering opinions about the biscuit-to-gravy ratio that he had apparently been holding privately for years and now felt entitled to share. Ronan was not a sentimental man. He had no interest in being one. But he noticed. He also noticed that Elsie, who had spent 2 years making herself as close to invisible as a 6-year-old could manage, had begun leaving her room before noon. She still didn't speak. She still watched everything from the corner of any room she entered, still positioned herself near exits, still went absolutely still when a voice was raised. But she was present in a way she hadn't been, and the kitchen had become her particular territory of presence. She appeared there in the early mornings, in the afternoons when the ranch hands were out, occasionally in the evenings when supper was being finished. She never said anything. She never asked for anything directly. But she was there, and Mara was careful with her in a way Ronan found himself watching more than he probably should. Mara never pushed. She never made Elsie's silence a question that needed answering. She just talked. Not to fill silence, not in the compensatory loud way that people who are uncomfortable with quiet tend to adopt, but simply about what she was doing, what she was thinking, occasionally asking a question she didn't wait for an answer to, which was a form of conversation that somehow managed to be more comfortable than silence, for reasons Ronan couldn't entirely explain. "I need someone to hand me the cinnamon," Mara said one afternoon without looking up from the pastry she was cutting. "It's on the second shelf, left side." Elsie, who was sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil she'd found somewhere, looked up. A pause. Then she climbed down from the chair, went to the second shelf, and handed Mara the small tin labeled cinnamon in the previous cook's handwriting. Mara took it without ceremony. "Thank you." Elsie returned to her chair and her paper. Ronan, who had been standing in the hall and observing this through the gap in the door in a way that he would have been embarrassed to admit, stood very still. His daughter had just done something for someone. Something small, something ordinary. It was the first time he had seen her do that since Eleanor died. He went out to the barn and stayed there for an hour doing things that didn't strictly need doing. And when he came back in, he had himself together enough to sit at the dinner table without his face doing anything unusual. The trouble with beginnings, Ronan was learning, is that they don't announce themselves as such. They just happen quietly, and you only recognize them afterward, looking back from wherever the road has taken you, and think, that was it, that was the moment. But while you're in them, you're just getting through the day, and the day has enough in it without paying attention to what it might mean. I was focused on other things, anyway. The bank had sent a letter in October. He'd put it in the desk drawer and not answered it. In November they sent another one, more specific in its language, less courteous in its tone. He'd answered that one with a partial payment and a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The third letter arrived 2 weeks after the storm, and the language in it had changed enough that Ronan read it 3 times to make sure he understood what he was being told. He had until April. If the spring cattle sale didn't bring in enough, and the numbers he'd been running told him it wouldn't, not with the herd size he was looking at and the market prices coming in from the eastern exchanges, Blackthorn was done. Not struggling, done. The bank would call the loan and the property would go to whoever had the money to buy it at auction. And there was only one man in this valley who kept that kind of money ready for exactly these moments. Silas Crow had been ranching the North Valley for 15 years. and in those 15 years he had acquired 4 additional properties under circumstances that the valley's residents discussed in low voices and didn't put in letters. He was not violent about it. That was what made him effective. He was simply patient. He identified operations in difficulty, waited for the difficulty to compound, then appeared at the right moment with a cash offer that was below market value, but better than what the bank would eventually extract. He was not a villain in any dramatic sense. He was just a man who understood leverage and had no compunction about using it. He had made Ronan an offer 18 months ago. Ronan had said no. He had made another offer 6 months ago, lower this time. Ronan had said no again. Crow had smiled at that second refusal. Not meanly, just with the patience of a man who knows arithmetic and is willing to wait for the arithmetic to win. Ronan had not told anyone at the ranch how close the arithmetic was to winning. He told Mara on a Tuesday afternoon in December when she found him at the kitchen table with the bank letters spread out in front of him and his head in his hands, which was not a position she had seen him in before, and which, based on the way she stopped in the doorway, was not something she had expected. She could have left. He heard her pause and registered that she had a choice, and could easily make the one that kept the professional distance he'd maintained since he hired her. She didn't leave. She came in, poured herself coffee, and sat down across from him. "The bank," he said, without looking up. "How bad?" He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "April," he said. Mara looked at the letters on the table, not reading them, just looking, and then at her coffee, and then out the window at the barn and the sky above it and the mountains behind that. "What happens in April?" she said. "Cattle sale. But the herd's down. I had to sell in September to make the October payment, which means I've got less to sell in spring, which means even if prices hold, the number doesn't reach the number I need." He lifted his head and looked at her. He hadn't meant to say all of that. He never talked about the finances with anyone, not the ranch hands, not the banker more than he had to, not the neighbors who asked because they were curious rather than helpful. "There's a man named Crow who wants the property. He'll get it when the bank is done with me." "What does Crow want it for?" "Grazing. He's building an operation big enough to control the valley's market prices. Get enough land, control the water rights, set your own terms." Ronan pushed the letters into a stack. "It's a reasonable business strategy." "It's not your land, though." "No," he said. "It's not his." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I see the ledgers?" He looked at her. "The operating numbers," she said. "Income, expenses, what the cattle are expected to bring per head, what the ranch costs monthly to run. I'd like to see the actual numbers." "You're a baker," Ronan said. "Before I was a baker," Mara said, "I managed the household accounts for a large operation for 3 years. Income, expenses, staff costs, supply purchasing. I'm not a banker, but I understand numbers." She met his eyes without looking away. "I'd like to see them. If you don't want to show me, that's fine. But you're sitting here alone with a problem and I happen to be in the room, so." He got the ledgers. He didn't know why exactly. He'd made the decision before he'd fully processed it, which was unusual for him. He put them on the table and went back to his coffee and watched Mara open the first one and start reading, really reading, not skimming, her finger moving along the columns, pausing, going back. She read for a long time. He made more coffee. Outside, someone was working on the hinge of the feed barn door. He could hear the metal sound of it, and the light moved across the floor the way December light does, flat and brief and gray at the edges. "You're paying too much for the grain delivery," Mara said. "The general store's the only supplier in range. Henderson and Billings delivers. He's further, but his bulk rate is lower. The difference over a year covers—" She ran her finger down a column. "Almost 3 months of the gap you're looking at." Ronan said nothing. "Your labor cost is high, but your turnover isn't, which means your men are paid fair and they stay." She turned a page. "That's not waste, that's investment." She paused. "Are they paid in cash or would any of them take a stake?" "What do you mean, a stake?" "Ownership share. Give the men who've been here longest a percentage of the ranch in lieu of a wage increase. They take on some of the risk, they take on some of the return. You reduce the cash outflow. They have a reason to care about Blackthorn surviving that goes beyond a paycheck." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "Most of them are here because it's steady work. I can't predict they'd want the uncertainty." "You could ask." She turned another page. "What does it cost you to ask?" He didn't have an answer for that. There's also this, Mara said, and she didn't look up when she said it, which he would later think was deliberate. She was giving him the thing without making him meet her eyes while he received it. Your bread cost. I don't sell bread. You could. He waited. Iron Hollow has no bakery. The nearest is in Deer Lake, 22 miles. I have the capacity to increase what I'm producing by 4 or 5 times without adding equipment. The oven is bigger than I need for ranch use. If you front the ingredient cost, I'll run the production and split the revenue 60-40. Your favor. She closed the second ledger. A wagon runs into town on Thursdays for supply pickup. Add the bread. See what moves. Ronan looked at her across the table and said what he was actually thinking, which was not something he did often. Why are you doing this? Mara's expression didn't change exactly, but something moved behind her eyes, something she was deciding about. Because Crow is going to get this land over your dead finances, she said, and that offends me. Because your daughter is finally willing to exist in a room with another person, and I'd like that to continue somewhere stable, and because... She stopped. Because? He said. Because I'm tired of watching powerful men take things from people who built them, just as a general principle. She stood, picked up her coffee cup, and went to the stove. Show me where the territory market reports are, and I'll have better numbers for you by Thursday. He showed her. By Thursday, she had a 3-page proposal written in the small, precise handwriting she used in her leather notebook, with actual projections and 2 alternative scenarios depending on whether the spring market prices held or dropped. Ronan read it twice at his desk and then went down to the kitchen and said, How do you know how to do this? I told you. I managed accounts. Whose? She was making bread and she didn't turn around. Someone who is no longer a factor, she said, in my life. He recognized a closed door when he encountered one. He did not push. The partnership idea, he said, for the men. I want to talk to them about it. All right. I don't know how they'll take it. How do you think Billy Fitch will take it? Ronan thought about Billy, who had been with him since year 1, and who loved this land with a specificity of affection that sometimes embarrassed both of them. Billy will be all right. And the others follow Billy, more or less. Then start with Billy. He started with Billy. Billy Fitch, who was 41 and had not owned anything in his life except a good saddle and a strong opinion about biscuit ratios, sat across from Ronan in the barn office with his hat in his hands and listened to the whole proposal without interrupting, which was how Ronan knew he was taking it seriously, because Billy's natural mode was to interrupt at approximately 30-second intervals. When Ronan finished, Billy was quiet for long enough that Ronan started to prepare himself for a refusal. You're giving us a piece, Billy said. Yes. An actual piece, not a paper piece. Filed with the county. Real share. Billy turned his hat in his hands. Once, twice. The ranch is in trouble. Yes, Ronan said. I told you it was. And if we do this and it still goes under, we get paid last. That's right. Another silence. And whose idea was this, Ronan paused. The baker's, he said. Billy looked up. Miss Mara. Yes. Billy put his hat on. Then I'm in, he said, with the finality of a man who had just been given exactly the information he needed. She's the only one on this ranch besides you who seems to know what the hell is happening, so if she thinks it'll work, I'll take the bet. Ronan said, You'd bet on her judgment. I'd bet on the fact that she's been here 6 weeks, and my breakfast is better, and Elsie came out of her room today without you asking her to. Billy stood up. Woman who can do those 2 things at once probably knows what she's doing with the numbers. The men's meeting was held 2 days later in the bunkhouse after supper, with the lamp turned up and snow ticking against the windows. All 7 of them were there, and Ronan laid it out the same way he'd laid it out to Billy, straight, no softening of the bad parts. 3 of them agreed on the spot. 1 said he needed a night to think. 2 said yes by morning. The 7th, a young man named Cord, who'd been with the operation for only 1 season, said he wasn't sure and might rather take his wages in cash if it was all the same. And Ronan said that was fair, and they kept him on with no change. By January, the first Thursday bread delivery had gone to Iron Hollow. It was a test run. Mara had said it herself, no guarantees, just see what happens. She'd produced 12 loaves and a pan of sweet rolls and a small batch of the dense honey wheat she'd been making for the ranch hands, which Billy had told her approximately 14 times was the best bread he had ever eaten, which was probably not accurate but was certainly sincere. Ronan drove the wagon in himself because he wanted to see what happened. What happened was that Lena Birch at the general store put the bread on the front counter, and by noon, it was gone. Not sold slowly through the day. Gone. By noon, people had apparently been waiting because the word had gotten out somehow, the way things get out in small settlements where news travels faster than weather. Lena Birch sent a note back with Ronan that said, "How many next week?" Ronan read it sitting in the wagon in front of the store, and then he sat there for a minute not reading anything, just looking at the mountains at the end of the main street and doing a calculation in his head. Then he drove home. He found Mara in the kitchen with Elsie beside her, and this was new, this was different. Elsie was not just sitting at the table watching, but was actually standing at the work table next to Mara, with flour on both hands, and an expression of intense and exhausting concentration on her small face, because Mara had apparently shown her how to fold dough, and she was attempting it with the solemnity of a person performing surgery. Ronan stood in the doorway. "How did it go?" Mara said, without looking up. "Everything's sold," Ronan said. "Good." "By noon." Mara did look up at that. "By noon?" "Lena wants to know the quantity for next week." Mara was quiet for a moment, doing something in her head that he recognized as the same kind of fast calculation he'd watched her do with the ledger numbers. "I can do 25 loaves by next Thursday if I have the supplies by Monday. We need more flour. I'll write the order." She paused. "Tell Lena 20, but I'll try for 25. "Why tell her 20 if you're making 25? "Because if I say 25 and deliver 20, she tells someone. If I say 20 and deliver 25, she tells everyone." Ronan looked at her. "Under promise," Mara said simply. He nodded. He went to write the supply order, and behind him he heard Elsie make a small sound. Not a word, not yet, not quite, but a sound of effort and minor triumph over a difficult piece of dough, and Mara said, "There you go. That's it exactly." And the kitchen smelled like bread and cinnamon and the particular warm flour smell of a room where things are being made. By February, the Thursday bread had become an event. 25 loaves were not enough by the second week. Lena Birch was fielding requests she couldn't fill and had taken to putting up a handwritten sign by Wednesday that said bread tomorrow in anticipation of demand. She had apparently decided to manage rather than miss. By the third week, a woman named Dottie Parsons, who ran the boarding house, sent a separate order for 6 loaves weekly to be delivered on Thursdays and Saturdays because her boarders had started requesting it specifically at breakfast. The money was not large. Not yet. But it was real, and it was coming in on a schedule, and when Mara added it to the revised projections she had been maintaining in the leather notebook, the April number looked different than it had in December. Not comfortable, still not comfortable, but different. Possible, maybe. If nothing went wrong, something went wrong. It went wrong on a Wednesday evening in the second week of February when Ronan rode back from the northern pasture where he'd been checking fence lines and found a man he didn't know, waiting at the gate with a horse that was too good for a traveling man and a coat that was too clean for the kind of weather they'd been having. The man said his name was Gale and that he worked for Silas Crow. Ronan said nothing. Gale said Crow had heard about the bread business, news travels, and wanted Ronan to know that his offer was still open, that it would remain open through March, and that after March, when the bank moved on the property, the offer would naturally come down because the circumstances would be different. Ronan said, "Tell Crow I'm aware of the timeline." Gale said he would, and smiled in the easy, practiced way of someone who delivers bad news for a living and has learned to make it seem almost friendly, and rode away. Ronan stood at the gate for a while in the cold. Crow knew. Not just about the trouble. Crow had probably known about the trouble for a while, that's how Crow operated. But about the bread, about the Thursday deliveries, about the fact that something at Blackthorn had changed, which meant he was watching, which meant he wasn't as patient as he was pretending to be. Ronan went inside and told Mara. She was at the kitchen table with the notebook and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she listened without interrupting, which he had learned was her listening mode. Entirely still, entirely focused. The particular quality of attention that made you feel the thing you were saying mattered and was being received accurately. When he finished, she said, "He's nervous." Crow? He wouldn't have sent someone if he wasn't nervous. He'd have just waited. The fact that he's making contact means the bread bothered him. She looked at the notebook. He didn't expect you to find a countermove. It's barely a countermove, it's bread. It's bread, and it's a community buying into the fact that Blackthorn Ranch is fighting to survive. That's not just income, that's politics. She looked up at him. He knows people in Iron Hollow are pulling for you now. That's harder to foreclose on. Ronan sat down. What are you saying? I'm saying make it louder, Mara said. Put the Blackthorn name on the bread. Make it not charity, not a sob story, just visible. People like being part of something that's working. Let them be part of it. Put the name on the bread, Ronan said. People remember where they bought something when they liked it. They remember the name. They tell other people. 3 towns over, there's a family that drove 20 miles to Iron Hollow last week because their cousin mentioned the bread at Sunday dinner. She held up a hand before he could ask. Lena told me. She said the cousin asked specifically for Blackthorn bread. By name. Ronan was quiet for a moment. You're good at this, he said. Mara looked at the notebook like the notebook was more interesting than his face. I learned from someone who was good at it in a different direction, she said. He used those same things, visibility, community loyalty, people's need to be part of something, to control people rather than help them. I've just been, she turned a page, applying the same principles to a different purpose. There was a weight to that sentence that Ronan noticed and chose, for the moment, not to pull on. All right, he said, we put the name on the bread. By March, they had 2 wagons going to Iron Hollow on Thursdays and Saturdays. Mara had hired 2 women from the settlement, a widow named Clara Ames, who had 4 children and a working knowledge of bread that she'd been applying only to her own household, and a younger woman named Peach, who nobody seemed to know a last name for, and who turned out to have hands designed for pastry work in some fundamental way that Mara recognized and immediately exploited. The kitchen that had been built for one person's domestic use was now producing 70 loaves a week. The smell of Blackthorn bread had become a Wednesday night constant that drifted from the main house to the bunkhouse and down to the creek road and probably farther, if the wind was right. Elsie was there for all of it, not helping, exactly. She was 6, and the work was beyond her reliably, but present in a way that was its own kind of contribution. She handed things when asked. She watched procedures with the concentrated attention she had apparently always been capable of, but had nowhere to direct. She learned to tell, by the sound of the oven, whether the temperature was right, in a way that Mara said was genuinely useful, and that Ronan suspected Mara said partly to give Elsie a job, and partly because it was actually true. She still didn't speak. But she laughed. Once, the first time, which happened on a Thursday morning in March, when Clara Ames accidentally tipped an entire bowl of flour and got it directly across the front of her dress, and stood there for one frozen second, looking like a ghost. Elsie put her hand over her mouth and made a sound that was absolutely, unmistakably a laugh, short and surprised, and swallowed immediately like she hadn't meant to let it out. Everyone in the kitchen went still. Clara, who was a practical woman and not given to sentiment, looked at the flower on her dress and then at Elsie and said, perfectly straight, I meant to do that. And Elsie's hand pressed harder against her mouth and her shoulders shook. Mara was cutting dough and she did not look up. But her knife stopped moving for just a moment, and when it started again, something in her posture had changed, a slight release somewhere through the shoulders, the kind that happens when something you have been quietly waiting for finally arrives. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Ronan heard about it from Clara when he came in for midday coffee. Clara told it factually, without embellishment, and Ronan listened factually, without response, and then went to his office and sat at his desk and looked at the wall for 5 minutes. 2 years. 2 years since he had heard his daughter make a sound of anything except fear. He got up and went back to work. That was the kind of man Ronan Vale was. He felt things deeply and sideways, never straight on, and the feelings came out in work, in the particular focused energy he put into fence lines and cattle records and the constant mechanical business of a working ranch. He was not cold. The people who knew him knew the difference. He was just constructed in a way that required translation, and Eleanor had been the one who spoke the language. And since Eleanor died, he had been living in a country where nobody could read his signals. He thought about that sometimes, more than he would admit. He thought about it that evening when he came in late from the barn and found the kitchen empty except for Mara washing the last of the bread pans, the women having gone home, and Elsie apparently already upstairs. and the kitchen still warm from the day's production and smelling the way he had come to think of as the smell of the ranch surviving. "She laughed today," he said. "Clara told you," Mara said. "Yes." Mara was quiet, scrubbing the inside of a pan. "You're not going to make something of it," he said. It wasn't a question. "It was her laugh," Mara said. "Not mine to make something of." He stood at the doorway. He was tired from the day and the cold and the permanent low-grade anxiety of a man watching a financial deadline approach. And he was also, he registered this with a slight internal surprise, reluctant to go upstairs. The kitchen was warm. The kitchen was the part of this ranch that was working, that had purpose and momentum, and standing in the doorway of it felt like standing in the warmest room of a cold house. "The crow situation," he said. "I keep thinking about what you said, about making it louder." "And?" "I'm thinking about a sign," he said, "for the wagon, something visible." Mara turned around and looked at him. "You're thinking about a sign. It seems you said visible." "A sign is a start," she said, and he couldn't tell if she was amused or just tired, possibly both. "Get some sleep, Ronan. The bank doesn't move until April, and we have 3 weeks." He went upstairs. He lay in bed and listened to the house settle and thought about bread deliveries and cattle prices and Silas Crow's patience and the way Elsie had laughed with her hand pressed over her mouth like she was trying to keep it from getting out. He didn't think about Mara. He specifically and deliberately did not think about Mara, which was itself a thing he noticed, and which told him something he wasn't ready to look at directly. The letter from Chicago arrived on a Friday. It came with the regular mail that Eddie Sparks brought out from the post office on the first and third Fridays of the month, a bundle of ranch correspondence and supply invoices, and the occasional piece of personal mail, all of it handed over at the gate and sorted at the kitchen table. Ronan was sorting it when he saw Mara come into the kitchen and stop 3 steps from the table. He looked up. She was looking at a letter at the bottom of the pile. She hadn't touched it, hadn't reached for it, just seen it from where she was standing, and the color had left her face the way color leaves things when the blood is suddenly needed elsewhere. He looked at the letter. The return address said V. Crane, Chicago, Illinois. He looked at Mara. She was absolutely still. It was a specific kind of stillness that he recognized, in the back of his mind, from things he had seen in animals that have been badly hurt. The kind that comes not from calm but from the temporary suspension of every system except the one calculating threat. "Mara," he said. She moved. Not toward the letter, away from it. 2 steps back. She reached out and put one hand on the edge of the counter and stood there, and he could see from where he was that her hand was shaking. "Who is V. Crane?" Ronan said. He already knew, in the way you know things that you've been half-sensing for a long time. He knew before she answered. Mara looked at the letter, then at the wall above it, then at Ronan. "Someone I thought was behind me," she said. Her voice was level. Whatever she was feeling was entirely internal and controlled, and the effort of that control was the most visible thing in the room. "He found you," Ronan said. A long pause. "He found me," Mara said. The kitchen was warm. The bread from that morning was still sitting on the rack by the window. Outside somewhere, Billy Fitch was working on something with a hammer. The ordinary business of the day going on around the fact of this letter on the kitchen table like a stone in the middle of a river, everything flowing around it, nothing washing it away. "Are you in danger?" Ronan said. Mara looked at him for a long moment. She was deciding something. He could see it happening, the calculation behind her eyes. "I might be," she said. "And if I am—" She stopped. "He won't just come for me. That's not how he works. He'll make it complicated. He'll involve everything around me. Everyone." She meant the ranch. She meant Elsie. She meant all of it. Ronan picked up the letter and looked at it, not opening it, just holding it. This ordinary piece of paper with its clean handwriting and its Chicago return address that had walked into his kitchen and changed the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. "Is he a dangerous man?" Ronan said. "Yes," Mara said, simply, without drama, which made it more frightening than drama would have been. Ronan set the letter down. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "I need to know the rest," he said. "What you haven't told me. I need to understand what we're dealing with." Mara looked at him. She looked at the letter. She looked at her own hand, which had stopped shaking, or was working very hard to appear to have stopped. "I'll need coffee," she said, "for that conversation." "I'll make it," Ronan said. She sat down at the kitchen table, not at the end where she usually sat, but in the middle, where she could see both doors, which he noticed, and which told him something about the body knowledge of a person who has spent years making sure they could see the exits. He made the coffee and sat across from her and waited. And Mara Voss, who had come to Blackthorn Ranch carrying one carpet bag, and a sourdough starter and the specific silence of a woman trying to disappear, finally began to tell him where she had come from. She told him about the house in Chicago first, not the address, not the neighborhood. Those details didn't matter. She told him about the house the way you describe a place where something happened to you, which is not as a location, but as a series of rooms and what each room meant. The parlor where visitors were received and where she was expected to appear at certain hours in certain clothes and say certain things in a certain tone of voice. The kitchen, which was her domain, and therefore the only room where she had any authority over anything at all. The upstairs study, which she was not permitted to enter. The bedroom with the lock on the outside of the door. She told it without looking at him. She looked at her coffee. Victor Crane, she said, was 47 when she went to work for him. A widower, a respected businessman with holdings in rail freight and a reputation for philanthropy that extended to a named wing of a children's hospital downtown. I was the kind of man people described as formidable, in a tone that meant something slightly different from admirable. He had a way of making a room understand, without saying anything explicit, that he was the defining force in it. She had been 22. She had needed work. The position was advertised as housekeeper and household manager, legitimate, reasonable, with a wage that was better than anything else she'd been offered, and references that checked out, and a preliminary interview that was entirely professional. "When did it change?" Ronan asked. "It never changed," Mara said. "It was always what it was. I just took 3 months to understand what I was looking at." What she was looking at, she explained, was a system. Victor Crane was a man who had refined the art of control to something nearly invisible. Not violence, not at first, not until the system was established and she had been made to understand that there was no alternative to it. It was small things, initially. Her days structured without her input, her wages held rather than paid weekly, because it's safer that way, for your own account. Her letters read before posting. Her visitors, she had few and fewer as time passed, subject to his opinion of their suitability. The violence, when it came, was calibrated. That was what she had never been able to explain to anyone who hadn't lived inside something like it, that it was calibrated, applied at specific moments to establish specific limits, never so severe that it couldn't be explained away, but always severe enough to be remembered. "I stayed," she said, "because by the time I understood it, the leaving itself was something he controlled. I had no wages saved. I had no place to go. Anyone I might have asked for help was someone he'd already worked to discredit in my own mind. She stopped. "That's also part of the system. You think the bars are locked when actually what's locked is your own sense of what's possible." Ronan sat with that for a while. He didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that wasn't reductive, and he seemed to know that. "How did you get out?" he said finally. "Carefully," she said, and by making him think he didn't need to keep looking. She had spent 8 months preparing, saving money in denominations small enough not to be noticed, making herself gradually less interesting, more compliant, more predictable, less individual, until Victor's attention moved, as she had hoped it would, to matters he found more stimulating than managing someone who no longer pushed back. She had cultivated a relationship with a woman named Ruth, who worked at a dress shop 3 blocks away, and who was the only person Mara had managed to maintain contact with outside the house. Ruth had agreed on a specific Tuesday in October 2 years before to tell anyone who asked that she had seen Mara Voss fall into the river from the Millard Street Bridge. She had, in fact, been on a train to St. Louis by noon that Tuesday. "He believed it?" Ronan said. "For a while. Long enough." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Ruth sent word 6 months later that he'd stopped asking. I thought—" She looked at the window. "I thought that meant it was over." She looked at the letter on the table. "Clearly it wasn't," Ronan said. "Clearly." He picked up the letter. "May I?" She nodded. He opened it and read it, and his face did what faces do when they're being kept deliberately quiet, which is not nothing. the muscles working slightly, the jaw tightening at a specific point that told Mara approximately where in the letter he was. He set it down. He doesn't threaten directly, Ronan said. He never does. He doesn't need to. He says he's coming to collect what belongs to him. Ronan's voice was flat. He means you. Yes. He's not right about that. No, Mara said, but he's not someone who's asked for permission before. Ronan was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter. Then he looked at her, directly, the way he rarely looked at people directly, the way she had noticed he reserved for things that required his full assessment. What do you want to do? The question surprised her. Not its content. She had been turning the question over in her mind since she'd seen the envelope. But the fact that he asked it at all, the fact that he asked her specifically what she wanted to do, as if that were the obvious starting point. She had spent 3 years in a house where that question was not part of the vocabulary. I should leave, she said. Before he gets here, take myself away from the ranch, so he has no reason to— No, Ronan said. She blinked. Ronan, no. He stood up from the table, and he had the contained energy of a man who has just made a decision and is already several steps past the making of it. You've been running for 2 years. He followed you here. Where exactly are you running to next that he won't follow? Mara opened her mouth, closed it. You built something here, Ronan said. The bread, the accounts, Elsie. He stopped on that word and then continued past it. Whatever you're building here, you don't leave it because a man with money and bad intentions is riding the same train line. That's not how this ends. You don't know how men like Victor end things, Mara said. He doesn't stop. He has resources and he has patience, and he has no reason in this world to care what it costs the people around his target. I know exactly how men like Victor operate, Ronan said, and there was something in his voice that was older than this conversation. I grew up watching a man like that take everything my father built. Different method, same essential character. He looked at the letter again. And I can tell you from experience, running doesn't fix it. It just relocates the problem. Mara looked at him. What are you suggesting? She said. I'm suggesting we stay, he said, and we prepare. The we was the thing she had to sit with. She had not operated as part of a we in a very long time. She had been careful about that. Careful not to be part of anything that gave someone leverage. Careful not to let anyone close enough to be used against her or to be put at risk by her association. It was a kind of protection she had constructed like a house around herself, one room at a time, until she was completely enclosed in it. Standing on the inside of it, you couldn't tell the difference between a safe house and a prison. Tell me what you need to know, she said. What Ronan needed to know, it turned out, was everything she knew about Victor Crane's methods, how he traveled, who he used, how he applied pressure, what he did when direct confrontation failed. She told him all of it over the next hour, and he listened with the same focused attention he apparently brought to everything, asking specific questions at specific points, the kind of questions that told her he was building a picture, not just absorbing information. By the time the coffee was gone, he had a list. She looked at the list. You're thinking about this like a tactical problem, isn't it? He's not going to ride in with a cavalry, Mara said. He's going to be subtle at first. He'll try to appear reasonable. He'll make an offer, call it assistance. He'll position himself as someone trying to help you while simultaneously making your situation worse. That's what he does. Like Crow, Ronan said. She had not thought of that parallel, but it was accurate. A different scale, a different toolkit. But yes, the same underlying structure. Good, Ronan said. I understand, Crow. He went to find Billy Fitch the next morning before breakfast. Mara heard them in the yard. Not the words, just the cadence. Ronan's lower register and Billy's occasional sharp interjection. And she worked the dough and tried not to think about what it meant to let someone else carry part of a weight she had been carrying alone for 2 years. It felt like setting down a bag you'd been holding so long your arm had shaped itself around it. The relief of not holding it was complicated by the wrongness of your arm's new position. Billy came in for breakfast with a look on his face that was not his normal expression. It was the look of a man who has been told something that expanded his understanding of the situation he was in and who is processing the expansion. He sat down and ate for a while without talking. Then he said, not to anyone in particular, addressing the middle distance above the breadbasket, Man who'd put a lock on the outside of a woman's door is a man who's going to find this a different kind of country than what he's used to. He didn't look at Mara when he said it. Mara didn't look at him. More coffee? She said. Yes, ma'am, Billy said. The waiting was the worst part. Victor's letter had been sent from Chicago with no arrival date specified, which was itself a choice. Mara knew his methods well enough to understand that the uncertainty was deliberate. Not knowing when he was coming kept you in a state of readiness that eventually exhausted itself, and exhausted readiness made mistakes. She refused to let herself be exhausted. She kept the same schedule. Early mornings, bread, the careful accounting in the leather notebook. She kept working with Clara and Peach, kept driving the Thursday deliveries, kept doing the thing that the ranch's financial survival depended on, and refused to let the letter on the kitchen table displace everything that had been built around it. Elsie noticed something was wrong. Children always do, and mute children perhaps more than others, because when you're not spending your attention on producing language, you have a great deal more of it for reading rooms. She appeared in the kitchen doorway on a Sunday afternoon. She had been upstairs with her paper and pencil, which was her weekend mode, and looked at Mara with an expression that was a question without words. I'm fine, Mara said. Elsie looked at her. I'm worried about something, Mara corrected. But it doesn't change anything about here. About this kitchen, you understand? Elsie looked at her for another moment. Then she came into the kitchen and climbed onto her stool at the work table and picked up the small piece of dough Mara had set aside for her to practice on, and she began folding it with the careful concentration she always brought to the task. She stayed there for 2 hours. Mara worked beside her and said nothing else, and Elsie said nothing because Elsie never did, and the afternoon passed in the particular companionable quiet that had somehow become normal in this kitchen, which was, Mara thought, watching Elsie frown over a difficult fold, the most remarkable and unexpected thing that had happened to her in years. She was still thinking about this when Ronan came in for supper and found the two of them at the work table with flour on their hands and a cooling pan of rolls between them, and he stopped in the doorway in a way he had apparently not broken himself of, and Mara looked up and said, "Wash your hands if you want one." And he washed his hands and took a roll, and Elsie moved the pan slightly toward him without being asked, which was such a small gesture that a person not paying attention would have missed it entirely. Ronan did not miss it. He stood at the kitchen counter eating his roll and looking at the pan, and then at Elsie, and then at a point somewhere on the wall that was not quite any of them, and Mara recognized by now the sideways way he received things that mattered to him. She moved the pan, he said quietly, when Elsie had gone upstairs. Yes, Mara said. She's never... He stopped. She doesn't do things for people. She endures people. There's a difference. There is, Mara said. He looked at her. What changed? Mara considered this. She's safe, she said. Not just physically. She's somewhere where nobody is managing her silence or trying to fix it or treating her like a problem. She's just a person, having a morning, making bread. She put the leftover rolls in the cloth. Children respond to that. Ronan was quiet for a long time. You know something about that, he said. It wasn't a question. Mara said, Yes, I do. Victor Crane arrived on a Thursday. Of all the days, a Thursday. Mara's delivery day, the wagon already gone to Iron Hollow, with Clara driving and a full load of bread. She was alone in the kitchen with Elsie when she heard the horse in the yard, and something in the particular rhythm of that horse's movement, confident, unhurried, the gait of an animal ridden by a man who is not uncertain about his welcome, made her go still at the stove. She looked at Elsie. Go upstairs, she said. Her voice was calm. She made it calm. Take your paper and your pencil and go upstairs and stay there until I or your father comes to get you. Elsie looked at her. Now, Mara said, gentle but absolute. Elsie slid off her stool and went. Mara stood in the kitchen and listened to the footsteps on the porch. One man, with a heavier footfall behind him, which meant two, and then the knock. Not aggressive. Victor never knocked aggressively. He knocked the way he did everything, with the confidence of someone who expects doors to open. She opened it. He was older than she remembered, or she had been remembering him wrong. She had been carrying him at 47 in her mind, and he was 3 years past that now, 50, with more gray at his temples and a coat that was new and expensive and slightly wrong for Montana weather. which told her he had bought it specifically for this trip and had not asked anyone with actual experience of Montana winters for advice. "Mara," he said, warm, pleased, the tone of a man encountering something that had been temporarily mislaid. "You look well." "Mr. Crane," she said. The man behind him was broad across the shoulders and carried himself the way hired men carry themselves when they are hired for their size rather than their company. She clocked him and looked back at Victor. "You should have written ahead," she said. "I could have prepared something." He smiled. The smile was exactly as she remembered, practiced, appropriate, giving nothing away. "I thought a surprise might be more pleasant." "For whom?" she said. He studied her. Something shifted in his expression, barely, but she had 3 years of reading that face. "You've changed," he said. "Most things do, given time." "May I come in?" "No," she said. That surprised him. She could see it, not dramatically, not a flinch, just a very slight recalibration, the kind a man makes when the terrain is not what he mapped. He had expected, she knew what he had expected. Fear, first, then compliance. Then the careful management of the situation back toward his desired outcome. He had done it 100 times. He was very good at it. But she was not standing in a parlor in Chicago. She was standing in a doorway in Montana with flour on her apron and 2 years of running and building and surviving in her bones, and her knees were not shaking, which surprised her a little even now. "I understand this must be," he began. "He won't be going inside." Ronan's voice came from her left. He had come around the corner of the house, and Billy Fitch was behind him, and behind Billy were 2 of the other ranch hands, and none of them were doing anything threatening, just standing, the way men stand when they have decided something. Victor looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Victor. "This is private business," Victor said. "This is my property," Ronan said, "which makes it my business." Victor's composure was remarkable. Mara had to give him that. He did not bluster. He did not threaten, not directly. He said, "I have a legal interest in Miss Voss's welfare." "Mara works for me," Ronan said. "She's here of her own choosing. Her welfare is a matter she manages herself. You rode onto my land uninvited, and I'm asking you to leave it." "And if I don't?" "I'd rather you made the sensible choice," Ronan said. Something moved in Victor's face, the calculation of a man who has just assessed a situation and found it more complex than anticipated. He looked at the hired man behind him. He looked at the ranch hands. He looked at Mara. "This isn't finished," he said to her. Quiet. Just for her. "It is," she said. "For today, it is." He left. She watched the horse until it was gone around the bend in the creek road, and then she turned and went inside because her legs had decided, apparently, that now was the appropriate time to communicate the adrenaline they had been processing. She sat down at the kitchen table. Ronan came in. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. Then, "No, give me a minute." He sat across from her and did not say anything, and after approximately 90 seconds she said, "He'll come back." "I know." "He's not going to accept being told no by a woman and a rancher he considers beneath him. He's going to escalate. That's what he does. He doesn't attack. He escalates until the situation is so complicated and costly that people give him what he wants just to make it stop." What does escalation look like for him? Mara thought about the 3 years she had spent inside Victor Crane's methods. He'll come back with something that looks like leverage. Legal, possibly. A claim of some kind, or documents. Or he'll apply pressure from a direction you don't expect. Someone in your supply chain, your banker, something like that. He'll make the cost of resistance seem higher than the cost of compliance. Ronan considered this. He doesn't know about the bank situation. You're sure? A pause. Reasonably? Don't be reasonably sure, Mara said. Assume he knows everything. He's resourceful, and he plans ahead, and he spent the time between sending that letter and arriving here doing something, because he doesn't waste time. Ronan nodded slowly. I should leave, Mara said again. You already decided not to. That was before he showed up with a hired man. That was a display, Ronan said. He brought one man, a display. If he was going to do something, he'd have done it. Not yet, Mara said. He doesn't move until he thinks he has the advantage. Then we don't give him the advantage. She looked at him. How? I don't know yet, Ronan said. But there are 7 men on this ranch who know what he is now and who've decided, apparently, that this is their ranch too. That counts for something. She thought about Billy Fitch saying, "Man who'd put a lock on the outside of a woman's door." She thought about the 7 men in the bunkhouse who had signed partnership papers over a lamplit table. She thought about Clara Ames, who had 4 children and a backbone of cold iron and who had said, when Mara had told her only the outline of the situation, "You let me know what you need, and I'll be here." She had spent 3 years making herself smaller and more isolated because isolation felt like safety. She was beginning to understand in a slow and difficult way that it had never been safety. It had been Victor's preference. The isolation had not protected her from him. It had protected him from anyone who might have helped her. She was not isolated now. The thought was so unfamiliar that it took her a moment to hold it correctly. 3 days passed. Victor did not come back, and his absence was its own kind of pressure. She knew he was somewhere in the territory, probably in Iron Hollow or nearby, and not knowing what he was doing was worse than seeing him directly. At least at the door, she could look at him. In Iron Hollow, she had no idea what conversations he was having or what ground he was preparing. She kept baking, she kept delivering, she kept the numbers in the notebook. On the 4th day, Ronan came home from a ride into Iron Hollow with a look on his face that told her something had happened before he opened his mouth. He sat down. "He's been talking to my banker." Mara felt something cold move through her chest. What kind of talking? The kind where he positions himself as a concerned party with information about my operation that might affect the bank's confidence in my ability to make good on the loan. Ronan's voice was extremely controlled. He implied, according to Wilson at the bank, who told me because Wilson apparently doesn't like Crane's manner, that there are questions about certain business practices here. He didn't specify. He just introduced doubt. "That's what he does," Mara said. "He doesn't have to be specific. Doubt is the product. Wilson is not going to move on the loan before April. He told me that directly, and I believe him. But—" Ronan stopped. "But Crane knows about the loan now," Mara said. "Yes." She sat with that. He was looking for pressure points and found one. She looked at the notebook. "This is how he works. He doesn't come at you directly. He finds what you're already worried about and applies himself to it. He's also talking to people in town," Ronan said. "I don't know exactly what he's saying, but 2 people made comments today that they were friendly, but they were checking, making sure things were all right." "He's building a narrative," Mara said. "Something about you or the ranch that he can use later to explain whatever he decides to do. He's setting the scene before the action." Ronan said, "We need to move faster than he's planning." "On what?" "Everything." He looked at the notebook. "The bread, the finances. Can we accelerate any of it? Change any of the numbers before April?" Mara pulled the notebook toward her and opened it. She sat there for a few minutes in the silence that she worked in, going through columns, running things forward. "If I expand to 3 delivery days instead of 2, she said slowly, "and if Clara can take on additional production," she mentioned her sister-in-law has time, "we could increase volume by 40%. The income differential would be," she ran the calculation, "significant. Not enough alone, but in combination with the cattle sale projections." "Do it," Ronan said. "I need the ingredient supply to match. That's the Henderson order you're going to have to authorize." "Authorize it tonight. What else?" She turned a page. "The Billings Hotel has been sending inquiries through Lena. They want to know about regular wholesale supply. I've been holding off because I wasn't sure about production capacity. If Clara's sister-in-law is actually available, find out tomorrow." She looked up at him. He was leaning forward with his elbows on the table, and there was something in his expression that was new. Not the controlled flatness he usually wore, but something underneath it, something urgent and specific and aimed. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she said. "Because I'm trying to figure out how someone with your ability to see all of this ended up in a house in Chicago with a lock on the outside of her door," he said. It came out rougher than he probably intended. Mara was quiet. "I'm not—" he started. "I know what you're not," she said, "and I'll tell you why since you're asking directly." She looked at the window. "Because I was 22 and I needed work, and he was very good at being the most capable, certain, reliable person in a room. And when you're young and not certain of much yourself, that reads as safe." She paused. "Competence and control look the same from the outside until you're inside them." Ronan said nothing. "I am not 22, Mara said. and I am considerably more certain than I was. She closed the notebook. So, 3 delivery days, Henderson order. Talk to Clara about her sister-in-law. What else? I want to talk to Jonas Bell, Ronan said. Mara frowned. Who is Jonas Bell? Territorial investigator. He worked a case near here 2 years ago. Fraud, some land scheme. He's thorough and he's honest, which in my experience is not a combination you take for granted in that line of work. Ronan looked at the letter still sitting on the kitchen counter. If Crane has been doing what you've described, if there are other women, other situations, other people he's operated this way with, Bell might have interest in that. Mara looked at the letter. She had thought, in a distant way, about what Victor did when she left, about whether there had been someone after her, another position advertised in a newspaper, another young woman who needed work. She had thought about it in the specific way you think about something you can do nothing about, which is to put it in a box and not open the box, because the alternative is not manageable. He might not have a case, she said. He might, Ronan said. You said Crane has money and connections in Chicago. If Bell has been building something, if there are other complaints somewhere, your information adds to it. He met her eyes. You don't have to fight this alone, Mara. That's what I keep... He stopped. Started again more quietly. That's what I keep trying to say. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she had told Elsie, that sometimes you can't reach someone when they're in the middle. You just have to be there, keep the edges steady. She thought about what it was like to have someone doing that for you. Write to Bell, she said. Ronan nodded. He wrote that night. She saw the lamp under his office door at midnight when she came down for water. She stood in the dark hallway for a moment, looking at the line of light, and thought about the strangeness of being somewhere where other people were awake in the middle of the night on your account. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the house, Billy's snoring from the bunkhouse, faint through the walls. The wind, milder now in the late days of March. The settling of timbers. The small sounds of a place that was occupied and alive. She thought about what Ronan had said. You don't have to fight this alone. The word alone sat in her chest in a specific way, like something that had been compressed for a very long time being given, cautiously and provisionally, slightly more space. She was still awake at 2 in the morning when she heard Elsie. Not screaming, not this time. A smaller sound. The sound of a child who has woken from something frightening and is trying to decide whether to make noise about it or manage it alone. Mara got up. She was at Elsie's door before she had fully decided to be there, the same way she had been on the night of the storm, the decision made below the level of deliberation. She opened the door. Elsie was sitting up in bed, both hands in her lap, looking at the dark window. She was breathing too fast in the specific rhythm of someone managing down from bad dream. Mara sat on the edge of the mattress. She did not put her hands out this time. She just sat. I'm here, she said. Same quiet, same level. The wind's low tonight. The bread from today is still on the rack. Everything's where you left it. Elsie turned and looked at her. And then she did something she had not done before. She moved, not much, but deliberately, until her shoulder was against Mara's arm. Just that. The small weight of a child's shoulder against an adult's arm in the dark, claiming comfort in the only language currently available to her. Mara did not move. She sat very still and let Elsie's breathing slow, and let the dark room be what it was, a room at night, nothing more, nothing that needed fixing. After a while, Elsie lay back down. Mara reached over and pulled up the quilt. She was at the door when Elsie's voice came. It was barely a sound, barely a word. 2 letters and a breath. But Mara heard it. She stood with her hand on the doorframe and her back to the room and let the word land. Stay. She stood there for what felt like a long time with that word in her chest where the compressed thing had been, and she felt it. The thing releasing, the space opening, the particular and devastating simplicity of being somewhere someone needed you to remain. She turned around. She went back to the chair beside the bed, Ronan's chair, the one he sometimes sat in. She didn't know why it was there, but she was glad of it, and she sat down. Elsie's eyes were already closing. Mara sat in the dark and held the word stay like something she had been handed that she was not certain she had earned and was terrified of dropping. She sat there until the room went from black to gray to the pale particular blue of almost morning, when the birds started and the ranch stirred and the day came back for another attempt. She sat there and she did not leave. And somewhere in those hours, between Elsie's quiet breathing and the lightning window and the ranch coming slowly back to life around her, Mara Voss made the decision she had been circling for weeks. She was not going to run. Not from Victor. Not from this house. Not from the kitchen, and the bread, and the ledger numbers, and the man downstairs who wrote letters at midnight for her sake, and the child in this bed who had just used her first word in 2 years to ask Mara to stay. She was not going to disappear from this. She had come to Blackthorn Ranch to become nobody. She was going to have to figure out how to be somebody instead. Ronan found out about the word the way he found out about most things that happened in his own house, late and from the wrong direction. It was Billy who told him, which meant Mara had told Clara, which meant Clara had told Billy, which meant it had made the full circuit of the ranch by the time it reached Ronan at the breakfast table on a Saturday morning when he was trying to read a supply invoice and drink coffee at the same time. Billy sat down across from him and said, without preamble, "Elsie talked." Ronan set down the invoice. "One word," Billy said. But Clara said Miss Mara looked like she'd been handed something she'd been waiting on for a long time. Ronan picked up his coffee cup. "Put it down." Picked up the invoice again and then put that down too, because apparently his hands needed something to do and couldn't decide what. "One word," he said. "Stay," Billy said. "She asked Miss Mara to stay." Ronan sat with that. He sat with it the way you sit with news that is too large for the moment you're in, that requires a different, quieter moment to receive properly. And you know you won't get that moment right now, so you just hold the thing carefully and keep moving. "All right," he said. Billy looked at him. "All right," Billy repeated, with the tone of a man who finds this response inadequate but is not going to say so directly. "What do you want me to say, Billy?" Something that sounds like a human man who just heard his daughter spoke for the first time in 2 years. Ronan looked at the table. "She asked Mara to stay," he said. "Not me." The silence that followed that sentence was specific and loud. Billy said very carefully, "That doesn't mean what you're making it mean." "I'm not making it mean anything. You're sitting there looking like you lost something when you actually just got told your daughter is coming back to herself. And the only reason I can figure for that face is that you're spending your time on the wrong part of the story." Billy stood up and picked up his coffee. "The woman stayed. That's the thing. Your daughter asked, and the woman stayed, and they sat there together until morning." He headed for the door. "Think about that part for a while instead." He left Ronan at the table with his invoice and his cold coffee, and the word "stay" sitting in the room like it had been said directly to him. Mara did not bring it up. She moved through the morning the same way she moved through every morning. Bread, accounts, the organized production of the kitchen that had become over these months, something that ran with the particular efficiency of a system built by someone who thinks about systems. She was at the work table when Ronan came to refill his coffee, and she glanced up and said, "The Henderson delivery is coming Tuesday instead of Monday. I got a note yesterday. It doesn't affect this week's production, but I'll need to adjust Thursday's quantities." "All right," Ronan said. She looked at him. "You talked to Billy." "Billy talked to me." She turned back to the dough. He stood at the stove for a moment. She said, "Stay." "Hey." "Yes." "To you." "Yes." Mara's hands kept moving, pressing, turning, the rhythm she worked in that was by now as familiar to him as the sound of the ranch hands in the morning. Children ask for what feels safe. It wasn't about me specifically. She needed the closest safe thing, and I happened to be it. "Don't do that," Ronan said. She glanced up again. "Don't make it smaller than it is," he said. "You've been doing that, making yourself smaller than you are, and you don't need to. Not here." Something moved in her face. Not much. The kind of thing that happens when a person receives something they were not prepared for and is deciding how to hold it. "She's been talking more," Mara said. Not sentences, but sounds. More sounds. She hummed yesterday when she was working the dough. I don't think she knew she was doing it." Ronan nodded once. He took his coffee and went back to his office and sat at his desk and did not look at anything in particular for approximately 4 minutes. Then he wrote to Jonas Bell. He wrote 2 drafts. The first one too vague, the second one more specific than was probably comfortable to put on paper. But he sent it anyway, because comfortable was not the currency they were working in right now. He outlined what he knew of Victor Crane, his methods, the 3 years Mara had spent under his control, the letter, the visit, the conversation with the banker. He did not editorialize. He stated facts in the order they occurred and let Bell do what investigators were supposed to do with facts. He sealed it and gave it to Eddie Sparks on Monday morning. The reply came 11 days later, which was fast enough that Bell had either been waiting for something like this or was a man who moved when he saw a reason to move. The letter was short. Bell wrote, "I have been building a case regarding V. Crane for 14 months. Your information is material. I am coming to Iron Hollow. Expect me the second week of April. Do not move against Crane before I arrive." Ronan read it twice and brought it to Mara. She read it once, set it on the table, and was quiet for a moment. 14 months, she said. Yes. Someone else reported him. Sounds like more than one someone. She looked at the letter again. Something was happening in her expression, a slow, complicated unwinding of something that had been wound very tight for a very long time. He's been doing this. The whole time I was running, he was doing it to someone else. Probably. I should have, she started. You survived, Ronan said. That's what you should have done, and that's what you did. She looked at him. You were 22 and you had no money and no resources, and you were inside a system designed specifically to keep you from leaving it. You're not responsible for what he did after you were gone. He meant it, and it came out with more force than he usually allowed things. Bell found his way to Crane without you. You're adding to something that already exists. That's not the same as failing to stop him. Mara was quiet for a long moment. You're very certain about that. I am. Why? He looked at her steadily. Because I've spent 2 years blaming myself for not seeing that Eleanor was sick, he said. And I've learned, slowly and at considerable cost to my general disposition, that blame assigned to the wrong party doesn't fix anything. It just uses up energy you need for the actual problem. That was the most he had said about Eleanor, directly, in any conversation Mara had been part of. He knew it, and she knew it, and neither of them made it a bigger thing than it was, which was the right call but required some effort. All right, Mara said. She folded Bell's letter and put it in the notebook. Second week of April. We keep moving. They kept moving. The bread operation had, by this point, taken on a life that Mara could not have predicted when she'd proposed it at the kitchen table with Ronan's ledgers spread between them. 3 delivery days a week. Clara and Peach and Clara's sister-in-law Ruth, who was built like a farmhouse and could manage twice the dough volume of any of them in half the time, plus occasional help from 2 women in Iron Hollow who had started appearing on Wednesday mornings without being asked, and whom Mara had decided to simply incorporate rather than explain. The Billings hotel contract had come through in the 3rd week of March, 40 loaves weekly, delivered via the stage line, which added a logistics layer that Mara had spent 3 days sorting out and which now ran with minimal friction. The money from the hotel contract alone had shifted the April projection into something Ronan's banker Wilson had described at their last meeting as encouraging. Wilson had also, at that same meeting, told Ronan that Victor Crane had been back to see him. This time, Crane had come with documents, a letter from a Chicago law firm outlining what he described as a financial interest in the welfare of a dependent, specifically Mara Voss, who he claimed had been in his employ and had absconded with household funds. The claim was false. Completely, entirely, documentably false. Mara had taken nothing from that house except the clothes on her back and her sourdough starter, and she had the letter from Ruth to prove the circumstances of her departure. And she had 9 years of the starter's existence as evidence that she had not acquired it recently. But false claims presented in official-looking documents by men in good coats have a way of introducing friction into situations that we're managing without them. Wilson had told Crane he would need to consult with the bank's legal representative before taking any action. Wilson had then, privately, told Ronan all of this. Because Wilson was 63 and had been banking in this valley for 30 years and had developed, over that time, a reliable instinct for the difference between a man with a legitimate claim and a man who was using the machinery of legitimacy to do something else. He's running out of time, Mara said when Ronan told her. Bell is coming in the 2nd week of April. Crane doesn't know that, but he knows April is when the bank moves on the loan. He's trying to complicate enough things before that deadline that you're either distracted or weakened when it arrives. He's going to push harder, Ronan said. Yes, he'll try something more direct. She looked at the window, a habit she'd developed, Ronan had noticed, of checking exits and entries without being obvious about it. He won't come here again alone. He'll have more men this time. How many men can he hire in this territory on short notice? Enough, she said. He has money. Money finds men. Ronan was quiet for a moment. Then we need to be ready. The conversation with the ranch hands happened that evening in the bunkhouse. Same lamp, same table as the partnership meeting, but the atmosphere was different. That meeting had been about finances and choices and futures. This one was about something more immediate. Ronan told them straight. Crane was likely to come back with hired men and a manufactured claim. There would probably not be actual violence. Crane was not a man who wanted bloodshed because bloodshed attracted the kind of attention he specifically wanted to avoid, but he was not above physical intimidation, and he would push until he found the limits. He told them they could stay out of it, that this was not what they'd signed up for, that if any man wanted to be somewhere else when it happened, no judgment would follow them. Not one of them left the table. Billy said, "We signed papers that say this ranch is partly ours. Man comes onto our property and tries to take something that ain't his. That's our business, same as yours." Cord, the youngest, who had taken his wages in cash instead of the steak, said, "I'll be here too if that's all right. I didn't take the steak, but I've been eating that bread for 3 months and I figure that counts for something." That got a laugh. Brief, specific, the kind that releases pressure without dismissing the seriousness. And then the meeting got practical. Positions, signals, what to do in what scenario. Ronan laid it out the way he laid out cattle operations, clearly, with contingencies, assigning roles based on who was good at what. Billy would be at the main gate, Cord and 2 others at the barn and the south approach. Ronan himself at the house. Mara, Ronan said, would be in the kitchen. "No," Mara said. She had been standing in the bunkhouse doorway for most of this, which nobody had commented on. "I won't be in the kitchen." Mara, "He came here for me," she said. "If I'm in the kitchen, he goes through whoever is between us to get there. I'm not doing that." She looked at Ronan. "I'll be at the door, the front door, same as last time." Last time was one man and a display. "This time I'll have you behind me," she said. "And I'd like to be the first thing he sees because that's what he's not expecting. He's expecting me to be hidden. He's expecting you to be the face of this. He doesn't expect me to stand in a door and tell him no with 7 men at my back." She held his gaze. "That's the thing that will actually unsettle him, not a show of force. He can counter a show of force. He can't counter me standing there like I have nowhere else I'd rather be." The bunkhouse was quiet. Billy looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Mara. He thought about Elsie's word in the dark. He thought about the 3-page projection she had written in 2 days that had changed their April number from impossible to possible. He thought about her at the front door 3 weeks ago, flower on her apron, knees steady, telling Victor Crane that she was not receiving visitors. "All right," he said. April arrived with the particular cruelty of Montana spring, which is to say, it arrived looking like winter with minor aspirations. The creek was running high from snowmelt. The mud was significant. The cattle were restless, and the fencing in the north pasture had taken damage from the melt runoff and needed 2 days of repair work that Ronan and Billy handled while Cord kept watch at the gate. Nothing happened on the first 3 days of April. On the 4th day, Jonas Bell arrived. He was not what Mara had constructed in her imagination. She had been picturing someone official-looking, someone who carried the weight of institutional authority in his bearing. What stepped off the horse at Blackthorn's gate was a medium-height man of about 50 with a completely unremarkable face and the kind of clothes that would not attract notice in any room. He introduced himself to Billy as a cattle buyer and asked if he could water his horse. He introduced himself to Mara, in the kitchen, as Jonas Bell. He sat at her kitchen table and she poured coffee, and he told her without preamble that he had been investigating Victor Crane's activities across 3 territories for 14 months, that he had signed statements from 2 other women, one in St. Louis, one in Denver, and the corroborating testimony of a former employee of Crane's who had kept records, and that what he needed from Mara was a signed account of her experience, specific in dates and details, to be added to what he was assembling. "What happens when it's assembled?" Mara asked. "Federal fraud charges, for certain. The assault documentation from the Denver woman meets the threshold for criminal prosecution in that territory. If your account adds to that, and I believe it will..." He paused. "He won't be doing this again." Mara looked at her coffee. "How long?" she said. "I'd like to move within the week," Bell said. "I have reason to believe Crane is preparing an action of his own on this property. If I can serve papers before he moves, it changes his calculations significantly. You know about his plans? I know he hired 4 men in Billings 12 days ago, Bell said. I know he's been corresponding with a law firm in Helena about the manufactured claim. Yes, I know about the claim. We've been watching his correspondence. And I know the Helena firm told him 2 days ago that the claim wouldn't hold, which means his legal approach is exhausted, and he's going to move to the next option. The men, Mara said. 4 of them, Bell confirmed. Hired for intimidation, I'd assess, not violence. He wants you to leave voluntarily. He wants to create a situation where it's easier to go than to stay. He looked at her. That's been his consistent pattern. He doesn't want consequences. He wants compliance. Mara sat with this. She thought about the house in Chicago, the locked door, the 8 months of careful preparation, the Tuesday morning on the Millard Street Bridge where Ruth had stood and watched her walk away and agreed to lie about it to protect her. She thought about sitting in Elsie's chair in the dark until morning. He picked the wrong woman to follow to Montana, she said. Bell's expression didn't change, but something in it settled, the way a man's expression settles when he receives confirmation of an assessment he's already made. I'll need that signed account, he said. She wrote it that night. It took 3 hours, and she wrote 2 pages that she threw out before she found the version that said what needed to be said in the way it needed to be said, specific, dated, factual, without editorializing, because she had the instinct that editorializing would weaken it, and what she wanted was for it to be unassailable. She wanted it to be the kind of document that sat in a file for 30 years and remained accurate. Ronan sat in the kitchen while she wrote. He did not read over her shoulder or ask questions. He made coffee twice and put a plate of bread and cheese at her elbow at some point, and she ate it without fully registering it, and he was still there when she put down the pen at close to midnight and looked at what she'd written. Done? He said. Done, she said. She pushed it across the table, and he did not read it. She had not asked him to, but he put his hand over it for a moment, not holding it, just acknowledging it. She understood what he meant. She folded it and put it with Bell's copies in the morning. Victor Crane came on a Wednesday. Not Thursday, not her delivery day, not the day that would have been the most disruptive to the bread operation, which told her that he had not been paying attention to the schedule, or that the men he'd hired didn't know enough to tell him. In a strange way, that was reassuring. He was not as well informed as she had feared. He came at mid-morning with 4 men arranged behind him in the particular formation of hired muscle, visible but controlled, a display before an action. Billy Fitch was at the gate. Private property, Billy said. State your business. Victor's expression did something and impatient. I have business with the owner of this ranch. Owner's at the house, Billy said. Gates closed. A pause. Open the gate. When you've stated your business, Billy said, with the perfect equanimity of a man who has been on this ranch for 4 years and is standing on a piece of it that is partly his and feels no particular urgency about any of this. Victor stated his business. Billy listened. Billy said he would take the message to the house. Billy took approximately 7 minutes to walk to the house and back, during which time Ronan had appeared at the front of the house, and Cord and the other men had appeared at the barn and the south approach, which was not an accident, and during which time Mara had walked to the front door and stood on the porch. When Billy came back to the gate, he said, "You can come in. The men stay." Victor looked at his 4 hired men. He looked at the people arranged with casual deliberateness across the Blackthorn property. He looked at Mara on the porch, standing there in her work clothes with her arms at her sides and her face steady. He came through the gate alone. He walked across the yard to the porch, and Ronan stepped out from the side of the house and stood about 10 feet back, not between them, just present, and Victor stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Mara. "This is not going to end the way you think it is," he said. "Come up and talk," Mara said, "or leave. Those are the only options." He came up. They sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where Mara had written her account the night before, where she had proposed the bread business, where Ronan had spread his bank letters, and Elsie had left tiny stones in exchange for biscuits. It was not lost on her that this room was where everything that mattered had happened, and that Victor was now sitting in it. He was, she had to acknowledge, still a composed man. Whatever he had expected, he was adapting to what he found, quickly, without visible distress, which was the thing she had always found most frightening about him. His ability to recalibrate without showing the seam. You've built something here, he said, looking around the kitchen in a way that was meant to seem admiring. Yes, Mara said. It's impressive, genuinely. He looked at her. You were always capable of more than you were given credit for in Chicago. You gave me no credit at all in Chicago, Mara said. Don't revise that now. His eyes went flat for just a moment, just that moment, before the composure came back. I came here because I was concerned about you, he said. You came here because I left and you were not done with whatever you needed me for, Mara said. I know the difference. Ronan was standing in the doorway behind her. He said nothing. He was just there, the way she had been there for Elsie, keeping the edges steady, not reaching, just present. The legal situation, Victor began. Is not a legal situation, Mara said. The law firm in Helena told you so 3 days ago. I know about the claim. I know it was manufactured. I have documentation of exactly what I took from your house when I left, which is nothing you owned. You have no legal claim on me, on this property, or on anything in this territory. Something moved behind Victor's eyes. Calculation, reassessment. You've been busy, he said. Yes, Mara said. Who helped you put this together? I put it together, she said. That's what I do. I look at what's in front of me and I work with what's there. You should know that. You saw it for 3 years and then you put a lock on the door anyway. Kitchen was very quiet. Victor put both hands flat on the table, a gesture she recognized, one of his physical signals, the kind he used when he was done with the current approach and moving to the next level of pressure. She felt her heart rate go up. She kept her face exactly where it was. The men outside, he said. Are here, Ronan said from the doorway. Simple. Factual. 4 more men out there who, hired for the day, Mara said. You can let them go. There's nothing for them to do. Victor looked at her for a long moment. She met his eyes, directly, without dropping them, which was something she had not been able to do in 3 years inside his house. And the fact that she could do it now told her something about the distance between who she had been and who she was currently being. You think this ranch protects you, he said. I think I protect me, Mara said. The ranch is just where I live. Another silence. Then something happened to Victor Crane's face, something she had never seen there before, in 3 years of reading it constantly for safety information. It was not anger. It was not recalculation. It was, she realized slowly, something closer to the recognition of a man who has encountered a wall. He is not going to be able to get past and is in the process of understanding that. He was not done. She knew him well enough to know he was not done. But something in the room, the men outside, the documentation she'd referenced, Ronan in the doorway, or just the particular steadiness with which she was sitting at her own kitchen table telling him what was and was not possible, had shifted something in his assessment. He stood up. This isn't finished, he said. It was the same thing he had said 3 weeks ago at the door. You keep saying that, Mara said. I keep finding that it is. He walked out of the kitchen, through the front door, down the porch steps, across the yard, past Billy at the gate, to his 4 hired men who were standing in the road looking at the Blackthorn operation with the expressions of men who had been hired for a job that appeared to be not happening. He said something to them. They mounted. They rode. Mara stood at the kitchen window and watched until the road was clear. Then she sat down at the table and put both hands flat on it, mirroring, without knowing it, the gesture Victor had made, and stayed there while her heart rate did what it had been politely deferring during the conversation. Ronan came in and sat across from her. Neither of them said anything for a while. He'll be back, Mara said. Bell moves tomorrow, Ronan said. She looked up. I talked to him this morning before you were up, Ronan said. He has what he needs. He's serving papers tomorrow. He looked at the window where the road was visible and empty. Crane is going to ride into Iron Hollow tonight, and Bell is going to be waiting for him. Mara sat with this. He's not going to see it coming, she said. No. He's going to think he still has the upper hand. He's going to be planning what he does next. Yes. And Bell is going to be there. Yes, Ronan said. She thought about Victor riding into Iron Hollow with his 4 hired men and his recalibrated plans and his certainty that he had identified Mara's weakness and her limitations and the edges of Ronan's ability to protect her. And she thought about Jonas Bell, medium height, unremarkable face, The kind of man who was very good at not being noticed until he wanted to be, waiting in whatever room Victor would walk into. She almost felt something like sympathy. Not quite. Not after 3 years and a locked door and 8 months of careful silent preparation and 2 years of trains in strange towns and looking at every door in every room. Almost, though. Will it hold? She said. The case. Bell thinks so. He said your account was the most detailed and specific he'd received. He said, Ronan paused. He said you wrote it like you'd been waiting to write it for a long time. Mara looked at her hands on the table. I have been, she said. The evening came down over Blackthorn the way evenings did in late Montana spring, slow and long and still cold at the edges, but with something softer in the center of it. The days getting longer now, the light staying past what it had any business doing in February. The men ate supper in the bunkhouse. Clara and Peach had gone home hours ago. The bread from the morning was on the rack, and the kitchen was the particular quiet it was when the work was done, and the room was just a room again. Elsie came down at 6:30. She did this now, appeared in the kitchen in the evening sometimes, when the day was winding down. Not for any specific reason, but in the way of children who have decided a room is safe and therefore return to it. She climbed onto her stool and looked at the bread on the rack, and then at Mara, who was cleaning the work table, and then at Ronan, who was at the far end of the table with the notebook. Mara's notebook, which she had handed to him that afternoon so he could see the updated projections. And the scene was so ordinary and so specific to this kitchen and this family that had assembled itself around a bread operation and a set of bank letters that Mara had to stop cleaning for a moment. Not a family, she caught herself. Not, "Can I have some?" Elsie said. It came out small and rough, the voice of someone whose vocal instrument had been underused and was reclaiming itself cautiously, the way a door that has been closed too long requires extra effort to open. But it was completely intelligible. 4 words, correctly ordered, with the rising inflection of an actual question. Mara stood at the work table and held very still. Ronan's hand had stopped moving on the notebook. Elsie was looking at the bread on the rack. Yes, Mara said. Her own voice came out slightly differently than she intended, lower, less even. Of course you can. She cut a slice and brought it over and set it in front of Elsie, who took it in both hands the way she had taken biscuits from the empty plate in the early mornings, months ago, before any of this. And Mara went back to cleaning the work table, and Ronan went back to the notebook, and Elsie ate her bread. And the kitchen held all 3 of them in the ordinary way of a room that has become what a room becomes when people live in it together long enough. After a while, Elsie said, "Is the man gone?" Ronan and Mara both went still. Ronan recovered first. "What man?" "The one from before," Elsie said. "The one that made Mara's face do the scared thing." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Mara turned around slowly. Elsie was looking at her with the focused, direct assessment of a child who has been paying very close attention for months and has decided that the current moment is the appropriate moment to demonstrate this. "Yes," Mara said. "He's gone." Elsie looked at her for another moment. Then she looked at her bread. "Good, good," she said. Ronan made a sound, brief, low, the sound of a man whose chest has been compressed by something and has just released. He put the notebook down and looked at the table, and Mara looked at him, and they did not say anything to each other, because there was nothing to say that the room wasn't already saying. Elsie finished her bread. She got down from her stool and went to put the plate by the sink, which she had started doing recently, without being asked, just adding herself to the rituals of the kitchen, the way she had been adding herself to everything else. And then she stopped. She turned around and looked at Mara. She said, "Are you staying?" The question landed in the exact center of the room. Mara stood at the work table with the cleaning cloth in her hand and looked at this small person, this 6-year-old who had once left a stone and a feather on a plate in exchange for a biscuit and had spent months relearning the mechanics of existing around other people, and felt something in her chest that was large and complicated and did not have a single clean word for itself. She looked at Ronan. He was looking at her, not with the sideways quality he usually used for things that mattered, but directly, the way he had been doing more lately, the way she had come to recognize as him asking something without asking it. She looked back at Elsie. "Yes," she said. "I'm staying." Elsie nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already decided to believe. Then she went upstairs, her feet on the steps, careful and unhurried, the sound of a child who is not running from anything. The kitchen settled. Outside, the spring evening was doing its long, slow business with the light. Somewhere on the property, Billy Fitch was probably making a comment about something to someone. The cattle were somewhere in the north pasture. The bread was on the rack. The numbers in the notebook, last time Mara had looked at them, said that April was going to be all right. And Ronan Vale was sitting at the far end of the kitchen table, looking at Mara with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the contained assessment, not the managed flatness, not the sideways angle of a man who feels things he hasn't found the language for. Something more direct than any of those. Something she would need to find words for eventually, when the immediate business of surviving was done and there was space for what came after surviving. Not yet, but soon. Jonas Bell served the papers that Thursday night at the Elkhorn Hotel in Iron Hollow, where Victor Crane had taken 2 rooms and was eating supper alone at a corner table when Bell walked in with a territorial deputy and a document that represented 14 months of work across 3 states. Mara was not there to see it. She heard about it the next morning from Billy, who had heard it from Eddie Sparks, who had apparently been in the hotel lobby when it happened, and had the particular good fortune of a man who witnesses a significant moment and has the sense to pay attention. According to Eddie, Victor Crane had set down his fork very carefully when Bell put the papers on the table. He had read them without expression. He had said, in the quiet, even voice of a man who has not yet decided what his position is, that he would need to contact his attorney. Bell had said that was his right, and that the deputy would wait while he did so. He had not run. Mara had not expected him to. Victor was too careful for that, too aware of what running looked like, and what it cost in the accounting of appearances. He had gone through the process the way he went through everything, with composure and deliberation, and he had been transported to Billings 3 days later to face the federal process there, and the 4 hired men had scattered the morning after the papers were served, because hired men for intimidation have no particular attachment to situations that have turned legal. Mara stood in the kitchen and heard all of this and felt, not what she expected to feel. She had imagined, in the abstract, that the moment of Victor's arrest would feel like a door swinging open. Relief, maybe. Something clean and immediate. What she actually felt was more complicated than that. Quieter. It was less like a door opening and more like a sound stopping. A low, constant hum she had become so accustomed to that she had stopped registering it as sound. And now that it was gone, the silence itself required adjustment. She went back to the bread. Clara arrived at 7 and found her working a double batch, which was one of Mara's tells. When something was happening internally, the output scaled up. And Clara, who had become fluent in Mara's operational language over these months, made coffee without comment and joined her at the work table. After a while, Clara said, "You all right?" "I think so," Mara said. "I'm not sure I know what all right feels like without the other thing underneath it." Clara considered this while she worked the dough. "My husband died 4 years ago," she said. "February, in the bad cold. And I'd been so worried about him for so long, his lungs were bad, 2 winters running, that when he went I didn't cry right away. I just stood in the kitchen and felt nothing, almost. And then 3 days later I was hanging washing and I started crying, and I couldn't stop for an hour." She shrugged one shoulder. Bodies don't always know the right time. Mara looked at her. "Give yourself a few days," Clara said. "You'll find out how you feel when you find out." She was right. It took 4 days. On the 4th day, Mara was alone in the kitchen in the early morning, the rest of the house still asleep, bread in the oven and coffee on, standing at the back window looking at the creek and the ridgeline behind it, and the particular blue of an April Montana sky that was cold and clear and absolutely indifferent to everything that had happened in the valley below it. And something in her chest moved. Not dramatically, not the collapse she had been braced for. Just a slow, deep exhalation of something she had been holding for 3 years without knowing she was still holding it. The specific tension of a person who is always tracking the exits, always running a background calculation of threat level, always dividing their attention between the present moment and the possible emergency. That tension releasing, degree by degree, like ice going out of a creek in spring. Not all at once, just less. She stood at the window and cried briefly and without much noise into her coffee, which was appropriate because she was a practical woman, and the bread needed turning in 4 minutes. She turned the bread. The April cattle sale happened that same week, and it went better than the revised projections had promised, and worse than Ronan's most optimistic scenario, which put the actual number somewhere in the honest middle of things. Enough. Not comfortable, not easy, but enough to meet the bank's terms when combined with the bread income, which Wilson at the bank had reviewed and described in his particular banker's language as a sustainable revenue stream with demonstrable community penetration. Billy had translated this, when Ronan read it aloud at supper, as, "People like the bread and they keep buying it," which was accurate. Ronan made the payment on a Wednesday morning and came home in the afternoon and told Mara, standing in the kitchen doorway in the direct way he had developed, that the bank was satisfied, that the April deadline had passed, that Blackthorn Ranch was still Blackthorn Ranch. Mara said, "Good." Ronan said, "That's it? Good? What do you want me to say?" "I don't know, something that reflects the fact that 4 months ago this place was going to Crow's auction, and now it isn't, largely because of what you did with the stove and a notebook." Mara looked at him. "What I did," she said, "was add to what was already here. You had the men, you had the cattle, you had the land, you had a daughter who was starting to come back. I just—" She paused. "I moved some things around." "You moved everything around," Ronan said. She held his look. "So did you. You let me." He was quiet for a moment. "Silas Crow sent a letter," he said. "Came today with the bank correspondence. He's making another offer." "What did you do with it?" "I wrote him back," Ronan said. "What did you say?" "I said the ranch was not for sale." A pause. "I also said that if he was interested in discussing a cattle cooperative arrangement, shared market access, combined transport costs, I was open to a conversation, different kind of business." Mara looked at him for a long moment. "You offered Crow a partnership. I offered him a path to what he actually wants, which is market position, that doesn't require him to take anyone's land to get it." He shrugged, not casually, but in the way of a man who has thought this through carefully and is presenting the conclusion without the full working. If he takes it, he becomes an ally instead of a threat. If he doesn't, he knows we're still standing and not inclined to fall over. Mara thought about this. "Billy's idea?" she said. "Mine," Ronan said, though Billy said it was the smartest thing he'd heard since the bread proposal. She almost smiled. High praise. From Billy, it's a standing ovation. Crow wrote back in 10 days and said he was open to a conversation. The conversation happened over 2 weeks of correspondence and resulted in something that was not a formal partnership but was an arrangement. Mutual transport costs, shared market contacts, a gentleman's agreement between two ranching operations that had been positioned as adversaries for years. It was not warm, it was not friendly, it was functional, which was all it needed to be, and it removed the last active threat to Blackthorn's position in the valley. The summer that followed was the first summer Mara had lived through in 4 years that did not require her to think about where she would be in 3 months. She was still at Blackthorn. She was going to be at Blackthorn. The bread operation had by June expanded beyond what the kitchen could comfortably manage, and Mara had begun, with Ronan's backing and a modest bank loan that Wilson had approved with something approaching enthusiasm, converting the unused portion of the smaller barn into a proper bakehouse. Separate ovens, proper ventilation, storage for the ingredient volumes she was now moving weekly. Clara ran it during the day with Ruth and Peach and 2 other women from Iron Hollow. Mara oversaw and produced the sourdough, which remained her particular domain, her 9-year-old starter, the living thread that connected everything she had baked from the beginning, still fed and tended on the warm shelf above the kitchen stove. She had started teaching, not formally. She had not set out to teach anyone anything. But women came to the bakehouse and they watched and they asked questions, and Mara answered them in the same way she had narrated her work for Elsie in the early mornings. Not performing instruction, just doing the thing and explaining it. Clara's neighbor had a daughter who wanted to understand the sourdough process. Ruth's sister-in-law was interested in the account-keeping side. A widow from the south end of the valley had a good instinct for pastry that Mara recognized immediately and said so, which had apparently been the first time anyone had said anything like that to this woman about any capacity she possessed. Mara remembered what that felt like. Someone seeing a thing in you that you had not been given permission to see in yourself. She was not careful or methodical about it. She was occasionally impatient, which Clara told her directly on more than one occasion. She had opinions about how things should be done and was not always graceful about the fact that other people had different opinions that were also valid. She was better with the practical than the personal, better at showing someone how to manage a budget than at talking someone through why they deserve to try. She was not a natural teacher. She became a functional one, which required more effort and was ultimately more satisfying. Elsie turned 7 in June. She was talking by then, not all the time, not in the voluble, constant way of children who have never been interrupted, but steadily, with the considered quality of a person who had learned that words were worth choosing. She asked questions about things she was genuinely curious about, which was most things. She had opinions about bread, specifically about which loaves were better than others, and she expressed these opinions with the directness of someone who had been listening carefully for long enough that she had formed definite views. She called Mara by name still, not Mama, not yet, but with a specificity of attachment that was its own thing, its own word. The way she said Mara had a quality that no other word in her vocabulary had, and Mara knew what it meant even though it wasn't the other word. She was patient. She had learned patience in a hard school, and she had come out the other side of it with a version that was genuine rather than performed, which was the only version that held up. Ronan asked her to marry him in July, in the kitchen, on a Tuesday morning, which was not a dramatic choice of moment, but was probably the most honest one, because the kitchen on a Tuesday morning was simply where they had been for months, really, building the thing that they were building, and the question was less a proposal than a formalization of something that had been accumulating in the daily work of two people who had decided, without announcing it, that they were doing this together. He was not elegant about it. He said, "I think we should get married. I've been thinking about it for a while, and I think it's the right thing, and I wanted to say it directly instead of waiting for a better moment, because I don't think I'm going to find one." Mara was washing a bowl. She finished washing the bowl and dried her hands and turned around and looked at him. He looked back at her, the direct look, not the sideways one. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. "That's not—" she started. "I know it's not a speech," he said. "I don't have a speech." "I wasn't looking for a speech," she said. "I was going to say that's not the most complicated decision I've made in the last year, and yes." Something shifted in his face, the particular shift of a man who has been braced for a harder conversation than the one he's having, and is now recalibrating. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she confirmed and went back to the dishes, and he stood in the kitchen for a moment with the look of a man who has just gotten what he wanted and is slightly unsure what to do with his hands now. And then he went out to the barn to do whatever it was he did in the barn when he needed to process something in private. Billy Fitch, when told, said, "Well, it's about time," with the satisfaction of a man whose assessment had proven correct. They married in September in the kitchen, which was the right place, the room where everything had happened, where the bread rose and the accounts were kept and Elsie had first laughed and first spoken and first moved a bread pan towards someone as an act of care. Mara had not wanted a ceremony in the traditional sense, and Ronan had no investment in form, so what they had was the justice of the peace from Iron Hollow, and the ranch hands, and Clara, and Peach, and Ruth, and Elsie, standing between them in her good dress with her hair braided. Elsie had been very serious about the whole proceedings until the moment the justice of the peace said they were done, at which point she looked up at Mara and said, in the considered way she said things, "Can I call you Mama now?" The kitchen went quiet. Mara looked down at her. She had thought, in an abstract way, about this moment, had imagined it might feel complicated, weighted with all the things it implied. She had not imagined it would feel simple. "Yes," she said, "you can." Elsie nodded, satisfied, and went to find Billy, who she had decided would be the most appropriate person to tell first. The first winter after the wedding, Blackthorn hosted a barn raising. Not for themselves, the barns were in reasonable shape, the old bakehouse conversion complete, the infrastructure of the ranch in better repair than it had been in years. The barn raising was for a family named Garrett, 3 miles north, who had lost their barn in a fire in October and were heading into winter without it. Mara had organized it, which nobody was surprised by. She sent word through the bread delivery network, which by this point was a communication system as much as a commerce system, the Thursday wagon carrying not just loaves, but news and messages, and the ongoing conversation of a community that had found its connective tissue. Word went out on a Thursday, and by the following Saturday morning, 24 people arrived at Blackthorn with tools and lumber and food. They spent 2 days on it. The Garretts stood at the edge of their property and watched their barn go up through the combined effort of people they had known for years and people they had never met, which was the particular alchemy of a community that had been reminded through a bread delivery and a financial fight and a woman who refused to disappear that they were a community. Ronan watched all of this from a certain distance in the way he watched things that mattered to him, sideways, with the contained quality he never entirely shed. But Mara caught him at one point, standing near the half-raised wall with a hammer in his hand, and his face doing something unguarded that she recognized as the look of a man who has not had this specific feeling of a community behaving like one, in a very long time. She went and stood beside him. He said, "You built this." "We built it," she said. You, me, Billy, Clara, all of them. The bread was a reason to be connected." He was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor would have," he started and stopped. Mara waited. "She would have had everyone's names memorized by noon," he said. "Who belonged to who needed watching. She was like that." He looked at the wall going up. "Elsie's like that." "She is," Mara said. "She told me yesterday she wants to learn to keep accounts," he said, "when she's old enough, so she can help run the bakehouse." Mara looked across the property to where Elsie was standing with a group of children, actually talking, gesturing with her hands, the way she did when she was explaining something she was invested in, and felt the familiar complicated thing that she had stopped trying to name precisely because it was too large for a single name. "She'll be better at it than I am," Mara said. "Probably," Ronan agreed. A year later, word came from Belle that Victor Crane had been convicted. Fraud in 2 territories, assault charges from the Denver woman's testimony, additional charges in Illinois that Belle had not detailed but described as substantial. The sentence was significant, years, not months. Victor would be old when he was done with it, if he lived to be done with it. Mara received this news on a Saturday afternoon in the kitchen, in a letter from Belle that was brief and factual in the way Belle's letters always were. She had expected, when this moment came, to feel more. She felt relief, yes, but quiet relief. The kind that doesn't announce itself. Victor had already lost his power over her years before the verdict, had lost it in a kitchen doorway when she had stood on her own 2 feet and told him no without her knees shaking, and again when she had written 23 pages of precise dates and details and signed her name to them and handed them to a stranger, and again every morning since when she had gotten up and fed the starter and made the bread and done the work of a life that was actually hers. The conviction was the legal world catching up to something that had already happened. She folded the letter and put it in the notebook with the other letters. Belle's first letter, Victor's original letter, the bank's final satisfied correspondence, a note from the Billings Hotel renewing their contract, a drawing Elsie had made of the kitchen with all 4 of them in it, Mara and Ronan and Billy inexplicably, and the sourdough starter in its crock, labeled in Elsie's handwriting, "The Family." She showed Ronan the letter that evening. He read it and set it down and looked at the table for a moment. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said, and meant it fully, without qualification, for perhaps the first time she had said it to anyone. They sat on the porch after supper that night, a habit they had developed in the warmer months, the 2 of them, and sometimes Elsie and occasionally Billy, who would bring his coffee and make his observations about the state of the north fence or the weather or the peculiarities of the bread-buying public with the comfort of a man who has become, without any formal announcement, part of a household. Tonight, it was just the 2 of them. The summer evening was long, and the light was coming off the mountains at an angle that turned the valley gold and ordinary and specifically beautiful in the way of places you have looked at long enough to see correctly. The creak was audible. Inside the house, Elsie was at the kitchen table with her paper and her pencil. She had graduated from drawings to words, filling pages with observations and questions and lists of things she wanted to understand, which Mara suspected was the beginning of a mind that was going to need significant territory to operate in. Ronan said, "Do you ever think about leaving?" It was not the question she expected. She looked at him. "Not," he said, "not leaving here specifically, just whether you think about it the way you used to have to." She understood what he was asking, whether the movement was still in her, the old reflex, the constant recalculation of exits. She sat with the question for a moment, giving it the honesty it deserved. "Less," she said, "a lot less. She looked at the mountains. I still notice doors. I still know where the exits are in every room I walk into. I don't think that goes away entirely. She paused. But it doesn't run the calculation anymore. It's just information, neutral information. Ronan nodded. I used to think home was wherever nobody could find me, she said. That was my definition. The place with the smallest profile, the fewest connections, the least to lose. She looked at the kitchen window where the lamplight was visible and the shadow of Elsie's head was bent over her paper. I had it exactly backward. Ronan said nothing. He was listening in the way he listened to things that mattered, entirely present, not preparing a response. Home is the place you don't want to leave, she said. I know that now. I didn't know it when I came here. I thought I was hiding. She looked at him. I was arriving. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the porch railing. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just his hand over hers, the way you place something where it belongs. They sat there while the light went off the mountains and the valley went blue and cool, and the first stars appeared over the eastern ridge. The particular stars of that particular valley that Mara had not known the names of when she stepped off the train in November of last year, and that she now knew the way you know things that belong to the place you live, not as information, but as landmarks. Inside the house, Elsie moved to the window. Her silhouette appeared there for a moment, small, sharp, the posture of a child who is looking for something outside and then finding it, being satisfied by what she sees. She stayed in the window for a moment. Then she went back to her paper. Mara watched her go and thought about what it meant, what it actually meant, not in the abstract but in the specific daily texture of it, to be somewhere a child looked out a window to find you and then returned to her work without worry. The trust in that. The ordinary, hard-won, irreplaceable trust. She had come to Blackthorn Ranch carrying a carpet bag and a sourdough starter and the accumulated weight of 3 years of surviving inside someone else's definition of what she was allowed to be. She had arrived at a dying ranch where a man was drowning in debt and grief, and a little girl had locked herself inside silence like the only room she knew how to live in. None of them had been looking for what they found. That was probably why they had found it. The things you go looking for with a clear purpose, those you can plan for, protect against, keep at the right distance. The things that arrive sideways through back doors, in the form of a breakfast plate left out for a silent child and a stone and a feather left in return. Those things get past your defenses because they don't announce themselves as the things that will change everything. They just happen. And then you look back from wherever you are, on a porch in the late evening with your hand under someone else's and your daughter's lamp in the window, and you think, that was it. That was the moment it started. And you realize you can't identify a single moment because it was all of the moments. And the moments were made of bread and ledger numbers, and a child's first laugh, and a word said in the dark, and letters written at midnight, and men who stayed when they could have left, and a woman who finally understood that surviving and living are not the same country, and you don't need a map to get from one to the other. You just need to stop running long enough to arrive. Mara had spent half her life learning that. She was done learning it.